There is a deeply arrogant, fragile illusion that humanity has nurtured since we first stood upright against the wild. It is an illusion built upon the comforting clink of iron tools, the perceived permanence of stone walls, and the artificial warmth of a controlled fire. We walk through our modern glass labyrinths, entirely convinced that we have tamed the primordial, pulsing chaos of the natural world. We believe that civilization is a final destination, an unbreakable armor of morality that shields our souls from the ancient beast that still sleeps within us. But the truth is far more terrifying, and it waits just beyond the reach of our streetlights. Civilization is merely a thin, brittle veil of frost, draped over a boiling, pitch-black ocean of ancient predatory instinct. It takes very little to shatter that veil. It does not require a nuclear winter or a cosmic impact. Often, all it takes is a few degrees of temperature, a few missed meals, and a few feet of relentless, unyielding snow. When the lights finally go out, and the artificial heat fades into a memory, the modern man discovers a horrific ancient truth. He is not the master of nature. He is not the conqueror of the elements. He is merely its most fragile, temporary tenant, living on a grace period that can be revoked at any moment. In the year 1846, the American spirit was possessed by a fever of expansion, a collective borderless hallucination known as manifest destiny. It was a time of grand arrogance, where the horizon was viewed not as a boundary, but as a birthright. Thousands turned their backs on the paved safety of the East, looking toward the golden, shimmering horizons of California. They viewed the vast, untamed wilderness of the West as a mere road, a map to be conquered by sheer force of will and the weight of their wagons. Among this tide of ambition were 87 souls, led by the Donner and Reed families. They were not desperate refugees or the dregs of society. They were the elite of the trail, the successful, the hopeful, the wealthy. Their wagons were not filled with survival gear alone, but with fine silks, heavy mahogany furniture, and silver sets. They carried with them the unwavering belief that their social status and their past successes protected them from the earth's raw cruelty. They left Springfield, Illinois in April, under a deceptive golden spring sun that whispered promises of eternal progress. But nature does not recognize your status, it does not respect your wealth, and it is entirely deaf to your prayers. Nature is a master of erasure, and as they sang songs of a new life, it was already spinning a white shroud for their ambitions. The first crack in their illusion of control appeared in the form of a man named Lansford Hastings. Hastings was a peddler of shortcuts, a merchant of dreams who sold faster routes he had never fully navigated himself. He proposed the Hastings Cutoff, a path through the Great Salt Lake Desert that promised to shave 300 miles off their journey. James Reed, a man of immense pride and restless, blinding ambition, convinced the group to abandon the proven trail. They chose the ghost of a shortcut over the reality of the road. It was the exact millisecond they stepped off the map and began their descent into the abyss. The Salt Lake Desert was not a road. It was a white furnace of crystalline salt and waist-deep sulfurous mud. The sun became a physical weight, a burning hand pressing down upon the oxen until their hearts simply burst. The shortcut did not save them time. It became a thief, stealing 3 precious, irreplaceable weeks from their lives. 3 weeks that represented the thin margin between a new life and a slow, frozen extinction. As they approached the mountains, the wind began to change, carrying a scent that was both ancient and predatory. It was the smell of the high Sierras, cold, sterile, and entirely devoid of mercy. Every step forward felt as though they were walking deeper into a trap that had been set millions of years ago. By the time they reached the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the air had turned sharp, tasting of iron and impending doom. The sky was no longer the blue of hope. It had become a bruised, heavy purple, hanging low like a ceiling of cold granite. The pioneers were ghosts of their former selves, their supplies dwindling, their animals dying, but the mountain pass was finally in sight. They believed they could outrun the rotation of the earth. They believed their human will was stronger than the atmosphere. On October 31st, 1846, the Sierras decided to strip them of that belief forever. One of the most violent and premature winter storms in recorded human history descended upon the peaks like a predatory bird. It did not begin with a gentle flurry. It began with a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountains. In a matter of hours, the trail, their only link to the world of the living, simply vanished. In a matter of days, the entire world was buried under 5 feet of heavy, wet, suffocating snow. They tried to push through with a desperation born of pure terror. They lashed their oxen until the beasts collapsed. They screamed at the uncaring sky, and they dug at the drifts with bleeding raw hands. But the wall of white was absolute. It was a physical manifestation of nature's no. The mountain pass, their only gateway to California, their only hope for salvation, was sealed shut by a 6-meter barrier of ice. The 87 pioneers were trapped at Truckee Lake, a frozen, jagged mirror reflecting their mounting, silent terror. There was no turning back through the desert, and there was no moving forward through the stone. There was only the weight and the realization that they were now property of the mountain. They were forced to build their own prisons. They constructed crude, windowless cabins made of rough-hewn logs and the rotting, damp hides of their dead cattle. These were not shelters in any human sense. They were subterranean cells, quickly buried entirely by the relentless falling snow. Imagine the psychological claustrophobia of those first few weeks in the dark, living in total, absolute blackness beneath 10 feet of packed heavy snow in a space no larger than a family grave. The only sound was the screaming, demonic wind above and the rhythmic hollow coughing of the starving within. The snow acted as a massive, soundproof blanket, drowning out their cries before they could even leave the cabins. They were buried alive, not by soil, but by water in its most beautiful and deadly form. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, freezing the very breath in their lungs. The air inside the cabins was thick with the smell of wet soot, unwashed bodies, and the creeping, sweet damp of the grave. Hunger is not a sudden pang of discomfort. It is a slow, systematic dismantling of the human soul. First, the body becomes a parasite unto itself, consuming its own fat. Then it begins to eat its own muscle, turning the body into a skeletal cage. And finally, when the physical self is exhausted, the hunger turns its teeth toward the mind. They ate the last of their oxen, even the bones. Then they ate their loyal dogs, their companions of the trail. When the meat was gone, they turned to the ox hides they had used to roof their miserable cabins. The hides were tough, hair-filled, and carried the stench of decay. Yet they became their last communion. Each swallow was a reminder of their descent. They were eating the very roofs that kept the death cold at bay. They boiled the old, hair-covered leather for hours until it turned into a thick, foul-smelling, gelatinous glue. It was a translucent mass of filth and despair, but they choked it down with trembling skeletal hands. They chewed on charred bones, grinding them into a fine white dust that tasted of nothing but the end of the world. In the absolute darkness of the cabins, the social contracts that define us began to liquefy and dissolve. Friendship, kinship, and even the basic tenets of faith were being burned away by the singular, agonizing need for a single calorie. On December 15th, the first of the group succumbed to the silence. Bayless Williams was the first to slip away, his heart finally giving up in the freezing dark. But there was no ground to bury him in. The earth was a block of frozen stone beneath the snow. They simply placed the bodies on top of the snowdrifts, where the frost turned them into white, marble-like statues. On December 16th, a group of 15, later known as the Forlorn Hope, launched a final suicide mission. They fashioned crude snowshoes from wagon parts and attempted to walk over the pass to find help. They wandered into a white sensory deprivation tank. No horizon, no sun, no direction, only the scream of the wind. By the 6th day of their journey, their reason had completely evaporated into the cold. One by one, the members of the Forlorn Hope began to fall into the drifts, and as the first of them died in the snow, the survivors did not look away with grief. They looked with eyes that were no longer human. They looked with the hollow, predatory eyes of the void. In the absolute, crushing silence of the mountain peaks, the ultimate taboo of humanity was shattered. They did not do it with malice, and they did not do it with madness. They did it with a terrifying clinical silence. They used their knives to preserve the only thing they had left, the heat in their own blood. They labeled the pieces of meat by name, so that no one would be forced to consume their own bloodkin. It was a final, pathetic attempt to maintain a shred of the civilization they had already left behind. In the camp below, the silence grew even heavier. The living stopped talking to one another. Words require energy that no one possessed, and besides, there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been screamed. They simply sat in the dark, staring at each other's throats, measuring the life that remained in their neighbors. Back at the lake, the camps had descended into a gothic nightmare that no historian can fully describe. The cabins were pits of shifting shadows where the living lay indistinguishable from the dead. Mothers watched their children's eyes sink deep into their skulls, their voices fading from cries into bird-like whimpers. The hunger was now a physical presence in the room, a third party that sat in the corner and demanded a sacrifice. By February, the transition from pioneer to something else was complete. In the flickering, dying light of a small iron pot, the line between man and beast was erased from existence. To keep their children alive, mothers were forced to perform a dark alchemy, transforming their neighbors into sustenance. The sound of metal scraping against the bottom of a cold iron pot became the anthem of their survival. There was no weeping anymore, for there were no tears left in their dehydrated bodies. There was no prayer, for the heavens had proven themselves empty and cold. There was only the rhythmic, mechanical, and horrifying act of chewing to stay alive. The psychological weight of this act is a burden the human mind was never designed to process. It is a form of spiritual suicide. To save the pulse of the body, you must murder the soul. They were ghosts haunting their own skeletal remains, trapped in a white hell that refused to grant them the mercy of death. When the first rescue party finally crested the pass in late February, they expected to find a silent graveyard. What they found was something far more disturbing to the human psyche. They saw a few hollowed-out shapes crawling out of holes in the snow like insects. Their faces were blackened by soot and frostbite, their eyes glazed with a terrifying 1,000-yard stare. The rescuers entered the cabins and were greeted by a scene that defied the limits of language. Mutilated remains were scattered across the floorboards like wood chips. Human bones, picked clean of every fiber, were discarded in the corners like common waste. One survivor was found sitting in the pitch black, clutching a piece of a human lung, staring at it as if it were a holy relic. They were no longer the brave pioneers who had left Illinois with dreams of emerald fields and golden suns. They were the raw, terrifying remnants of a shipwrecked humanity, stripped of every grace. The journey out of the mountains was, in some ways, even more horrific than the stay. Some of the rescued children, upon seeing the first glimpses of green grass and brown earth in the lower valleys, began to scream in absolute terror. They'd forgotten that the world could be anything other than a white, freezing void of death. For the rest of their lives, many of the survivors would never speak of that winter again. They walked through a world that looked at them with a mixture of pity and revulsion, the living evidence of what happens when the veil of civilization is torn away. Of the 87 souls who entered the Sierra Nevada, only 48 emerged to see the spring. The story of the Donner Party is not just a tale of a bad shortcut, a heavy winter, or a series of poor decisions. It is a permanent monument to the terrifying scale of nature and the extreme fragility of our own identity. It serves as a reminder that our morality is a luxury, a gift afforded to us by a full stomach, a warm bed, and a roof that holds. Take away the heat, take away the bread, and the distance between the saint and the monster is less than a single heartbeat. The Sierra Nevada mountains still stand today, cold, majestic, and entirely indifferent to our presence. The snow still falls every year, covering the traces of what happened in those dark, buried cabins. But the granite remembers the screams, and the frozen lake remembers the silence. They remember the sound of the iron pots, and the look in the eyes of those who survived. History is not dead, and it is not a story in a book. It is buried under 6 meters of blue ice, waiting patiently for the thaw. It is waiting for us to look into the mirror of the past and remember who we really are when the veil is stripped away. Past resurrected. History is not dead. It only waits to be remembered.